Hello everybody and welcome to the Sovereign Village Project. In the world of permaculture design, there's kind of a trend to really eschew any kind of focus on aesthetics as a design consideration. And I certainly understand why. We have spent a very long time as a society really ignoring anything practical when it comes to the way we design homes and landscapes, farms, cities, towns, roadways, etc. And so we're trying to run in the other directions towards, practicality. What can this property produce? But the artist in me, the musician in me, thinks that it's really still important and perfectly acceptable to think about beautifying our properties and to consider that as a design consideration. Bill Mollison talked about slapping lipstick on a pig, and in most cases I agree. You design everything to be very practical and then you think about aesthetics. But oftentimes I think aesthetics can be incorporated in with no loss at all to efficiency. And so I wanted to show an example of this because many of us are dealing with small properties, with areas in the suburbs, with yards that really have places where aesthetics matter. So one of the most famous elements of permaculture is the swale. It's a ditch designed on contour. I'll do a little illustration. This is not the kind of artist I am. I'm not an eraser board artist or any kind of visual artist, so this is going to be rough. Everybody stick with me. I did draw a nice little house and a nice little hill and some trees, some Bob Ross trees back here. So we've got our hill, and of course we have a swale, which is just a ditch dug on contour and piled up on the other side. All that rain comes down, and that rain pushes all the nutrients, the bark, the pine cones, the pine needles, the topsoil, worms, and everything, and the water fills the ditch as well as all of those nutrients. And whatever we plant there, fruit trees often, receives the benefit of all this extra nutrient, all this extra water, but also those roots do the job of soaking up that water and storing it. That's energy. They store that energy higher up on the hillside here, and then they return that energy to you in the form of fuel, the wood, or in terms of what they produce here, or forage from their leaves. But also they drop those leaves onto the soil below, and that rots down, and it becomes more really nice compost and mulch, feeding the rest of your system. So that's what a swale does. But let's say we're dealing with a place that does not want to have a giant ditch in the middle of their yard. That's often been the case. One of the properties that I designed, actually it was a permaculture fix and flip. The first thing they did was fill in the swale because they just didn't like having a giant ditch running through their yard, unfortunately. They were too obsessed with aesthetics. So what is a different way to do this? And the answer goes back to, in agricultural practice, to millennia, really as far back as we can look. People have been terracing. And a terrace can really it can fill that same function as a swale. So let's say we dug our ditch, we piled up on the other side, the only difference being we make some kind of retaining wall. It could be just giant landscaping timbers, logs, bricks, concrete. In this case, we'll say it's rocks that come from, as you excavate, you dig up a lot of rocks. So we've got this retaining wall built here now, and we pile up the soil against it, but it's still kind of going downhill backwards just a little bit, and then it's going back up the hill. So it's maybe not perfectly level, but it kind of has that appearance. But it's still, at this point right here, at the lowest point, it is still stopping that water and those nutrients, and we just plant our tree a little bit further back here to take advantage, or a garden, or whatever is using that swale. It doesn't have to be a tree. Trees make a lot of sense in most cases. And so now we have like a usable section of yard and of course, the retaining wall, maybe some steps if it's a really big retaining wall. It's a very attractive landscape feature. Retaining walls are beautiful, and they're a fun way to break up the landscape. It gives you more space to have level. If you're talking about a small yard or something, you might still want that space for kids to play around with and stuff like that. And I want to show you an example of that here on the property. I'm also helping design an intentional community right now that's dealing with kind of a similar site. They have a large septic field. And they also want to have a space for entertaining, and it's on a hill. So what we're doing is we're designing swales into their system, but we're really doing it in a terraced manner. So it'll be terraces stepping down this hillside with a stage at the bottom. And so this fills the practical function of them being able to host concerts and events like they want to do, and large gatherings with lots of gathering space. It uses up a lot of the septic field, and we still get our swale in. And so on a much different scale, much smaller scale, I want to show you how we're kind of doing something similar on this property. The reason why we're terracing is because we have a small section of yard and it gets a lot of light. So we want to grow food in that, but the problem is most of this is a septic field. So we're not really going to be doing much food growing above the septic field. We will be grazing the animals over it, and because we know it's in our diet, we're not too afraid to eat off of that septic field. But in general, you're pretty limited in what you even can grow over a septic field safely. And so we don't want to waste any of this light if we can avoid it. This really nice growing area. So I'm building a retaining wall just above the septic field to capture that last bit of land. It doesn't look like much right now, and the chickens are helping me build it. But we've got a retaining wall started here. That's these rocks. And then we've piled up sticks in hugel mound style. We have a ton of trees that came from this area. This was all forest. It was small, scrubby forest, but we had to take it down, and we really want to use that wood. So we piled up the wood on top of a retaining wall, and then we're going to be cutting back into this hillside for topsoil and layering that on top. So we're mixing our hugel mound style of agriculture and kind of a swale / terrace thing. But aesthetically, it's just going to look like a nice, pleasant looking terrace with a rock wall around it. But it's also going to be producing abundantly for us. There's going to be fruit trees there. There's going to be an arbor. That's an example of something else. You could really plant anything depending on the specifics of the swale and how much water it's receiving. So I hope that's helpful as people think about aesthetics in their design. Aesthetics do matter. Obviously, if you just let things grow wild, well, the aesthetics are taken care of, so we don't have to fight too hard for aesthetics, but there's always room to get a little bit artistic and really make your homestead a beautiful place. So hopefully that's helpful to y'all. In the meantime, stay safe, be well, and happy homesteading.